بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم إنا نستهديك لأرشد أمرنا، وزدنا علما ينفعنا وعملا يرفعنا وأحوالا وأخلاقا ترضى بها عنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. So a warm welcome to everybody to episode 8. I guess we're calling them episodes now, in the Rasa'i'l Readings series. And Alhamdulillah that we have now another opportunity to sit together once again and read another one of the Rasail of the ulama of this tremendous madhab, and an important risala. Of course, all of the rasail are important, but it's one of those rasail which Sheikh ʿabd al-Fattah al-Ghudda, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, actually did a tahqiq of, and this is the edition that we'll be using in today's session. Of course, today, given timings and the like, we will probably need to pause at some point for Maghrib. So Maghrib time will enter over here in the UK. So we will be pausing for Maghrib. We'll have like a 5-minute break or something, and then inshallah we'll resume immediately thereafter. When it comes to the text now, this of course is the تحفة النساك في فضل السواك, which at least on the announcement was gift for the worshipful devotees on the merit of brushing teeth. Of course, that's somewhat deliberate in terms of the title, as we'll see when we start exploring the idea of the siwak when he gets into it. As for the author, then of course he is inshallah well known to all of you. Sheikh, as he says here, al-Allama al-Faqih al-Zahid, Sheikh al-Ghani al-Ghunaymi al-Maydani al-Dimashqi. And he was born in the year 12, you can see here 22, and he passed away, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, in the year 1298. These are, of course, Hijri dates. And just to give some perspective, he's, of course, the direct student of Muhammad Amin ibn Abidin, so the Sahib of the Hashia. And of course, Ibn Abidin passed away 1252. So Maydani would have been 30 years old at that time. And of course, he was a very extremely loyal in terms of being a talib al-ilm, incredible loyalty to his teachers. And the teachers actually remarked that he had incredible adab as well. He was a person of great adab with ilm, with his teachers and the like. So it's something quite significant for even the teachers to point out that this man is a man of great adab. And really, this is the way of the talabat al-ilm, that if you don't have adab, it's almost like your ilm is worthless. Because this is not the way of the ulama, and it's not the way of the zuhad, and it's not the way of the ahlul salah, and it's not the way of the inheritors of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So this is why the first thing that we learn from the ulama is their adab. Right. So the first thing we want to learn is their adab, and also in their writings and everything, the entire hal their state, which is being transmitted down to us, that what we want to take from that is the adab. I mean, you see it really quite clearly. Sometimes it's very obvious, and sometimes not so obvious. But as somebody who's not colored by adab, then they'll only be colored by nafs, and that's why it will affect the way that they engage in ilm. It will affect the way that they understand the ilm, the way that they transmit the ilm, and so on. And this is not now being a faithful bearer of prophetic knowledge, because the idea is that you have to purify that vessel of your heart, as we know that the reality of it is that this knowledge is poured into hearts, so to speak. These are the futuhat which occur at the hands of the mashayikh. So as you study with your teachers and the like, these openings which you have. But part of it is ensuring that there is فَأَدَّاهَا, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَ. So he receives the knowledge, he hears it, he receives it, he understands it, فَوَعَاهَا وَأَدَّاهَا أو فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَ, and then he transmits it just as he heard it. So in order to be able to do that and to be able to transmit it faithfully, then it has to be colored by adab, like that vessel of the heart and that vessel of the ruh of that individual. It needs to be colored by this true adab. So alhamdulillah, we have an opportunity to read a text of somebody who was noted as being a person of great adab and great wafa to his teachers as well. And that's why they point out the fact that after Sayyidi Muhammad ibn Abidin radiallahu ta'ala anhu passed away, then there was some discussion about his library, right? What we're going to do with it, and let's give it away. And of course, his son is extremely young, so they're thinking about what's in his best interests and the like as well. And ʿAbd al-Ghani al-Maydani radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he actually purchased the library from the estate. He purchased it and he preserved it. So it's actually it's just an incredible act of loyalty. I mean, he didn't have to do that, but it was something that he didn't deserve, was, because unfortunately you hear some of these stories sometimes, like some alim has died, the family aren't interested in the ilm or whatever. He was the alim, just put all the books out sometimes, like onto the street, just let people take them. We don't know what to do with all of this stuff. And that's again a bit of a travesty, really. Of course, some of you may know Maydani from two of his great works. I guess his magnum opus is the Lubab fi Sharh al-Kitab. That was some text which is, of course, has been studied and is taught extensively as a sharh on Quduri. Of course, he also has a very important sharh on the Tahawiyya as well, which perhaps is less accessed and less widely taught and the like, but it's also an important commentary on the Tahawiyya. Interestingly, Maydani is actually a direct student of Sheikh Ibrahim al-Bajuri. Bajuri, as the famous Sheikh al-Azhar and the Azhari, who has the Hashiyat al-Bajuri, and the great Shafi'i faqih and Ash'ari theologian. So Maydani is actually his student. So, and of course, he has a number of different Rasa'i'l. He has a risala on hayd, has a risala, of course, over here. He has a risala. A number of his books are actually published. So his risala like the Ishaf al-Muridin is published and actually translated into English as well. He has a risala on the, I believe it was Imam Bukhari's statements from his Sahih, قال بعض الناس, and he has some. He has a risala on that, and then this is, of course, another one of the risala. Of course, that's not everything. I mean, he has other texts as well, but inshallah, that gives you a sense of the author, because if it's important to know something about the authors and the asanid and the like, it gives you a sense of the weightiness of the work in question as well. So inshallah, we'll jump right into this text now. Of course, this becomes even weightier when you have such a grand muhaqqiq, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, also working on it, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. And he has, of course, his own useful footnotes in different places. And he also has a short addendum. So let's read what he has to say here. So بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فقال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله المحمود بكل لسان المعبود بسائر الأوقات والأزمان الذي نضر وجوه الفقهاء, right, the one who illuminated the faces of the fuqaha, وجعلهم ورثة الأنبياء, and he made them the inheritors of the prophets. Of course, at the beginning he's just praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. والصلاة والسلام على خير نبي اصطفى القائل لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك مع كل صلاة. So of course this is part of the Burat, the Istihlal, the wondrous opening where he mentions the subject matter, of course in the introduction here. محمد النبي المختار صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تلاهم باقتفاء الآثار. So, and Allah bless him, give him peace, and he says, and upon his folk and his companions, and those who follow him, follow his, or follow their traces, or follow them closely in their tracks. Because this is the way. I mean, this is how we started today as well, in the sense that if you don't take everything of the deen in terms of the ibadah of the qalb, the ibadah of the limbs, and the ibadah of the mind, then there's a naqs. But if you don't, if the heart isn't resolved, it's not worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as it should be, which is basically why we learn the akhlaq. This is the ibadah of the qalb, just like you have an ibadah of the mind, which is aqida, and you have an ibadah of the limbs, which is the fiqh. Excuse me. He says, أما بعد فهذه رسالة مشتملة على فوائد حسان ودرر ثمان اقتطفتها من كتب الأقدمين من الفقهاء والمحدثين. So he says, to proceed, this is now a short treatise, or a treatise, which is comprised of beautiful points of benefit and precious pearls, which I have harvested and gathered from the books of the early scholars of the fuqaha and the muhaddithin. So the scholars of fiqh and the scholars of hadith. وسميتها تحفة النساك في فضل السواك. So I've called it, as we were talking about earlier, gift for the worshipful devotees on the merit of brushing teeth. He says, ورتبتها على مقدمة وثلاثة أثواب. Oh, sorry, وثلاثة أبواب وخاتمة. So he says, and I have ordered it in accordance with an introduction and 3 chapters and a conclusionary section, i.e., a closing section. Okay, so this is the first. These are his opening words, and then he gets into his introduction. So before we go any further, I just like everybody to take a moment to think about fiqh. So when we talk about fiqh, the focus is always on the ma'ani of fiqh. And when it comes to the ma'ani of fiqh, what are we talking about? We're talking about the usul of these masail, because every single mas'ala has an asl, right? It has some type of asl. And this asl really is it's almost like this abstracted asl. This is sometimes difficult to comprehend because we live in a material world, and you experience the masail through the world which you experience, so the world which you live. So when we talk about the ahkam, for example, of the masjid, you automatically start thinking about your local mosque. And you say, oh, the mimbar is over here, and the carpets are like this, and they put the shoes over here, and the toilets are on this side, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about anything else, like food, whether it be apples or pears or oranges, again, you think about your local supermarket, or you think about the apple tree in your garden, And sometimes when we do these types of things, of course, it's natural to think like this, but we can miss out on the fiqh because what we do is we use what we have and then we apply it backwards onto the fiqh, as if this is exactly what the fuqaha are talking about, rather than recognizing that this might be a manifestation, like an example, and it's not the only example of this particular thing. So as long as so that's why before proceeding any further, I want everybody to just forget what they know. Just assume you know nothing. You've never heard of the siwak, right? You never heard of the siwak before, right? So this is, if you do it like this, then you'll understand what's happening, right? So he says المقدمة في تعريف في تعريفه وحكمه. Yeah, sorry. The qawaid, yeah, maxims, right? So if you say qawaid maxims, then we're talking about the usul in the sense that the masala is connected to something, that there's a thinking behind it, there's some type of logic behind it. So that's so it's not just about the idea of the maxim, but in with respect to what exactly that represents. And inshallah, we'll see how that manifests as we continue this reading. So he says, السواك بكسر السين وهو العود. He says وهو العود الذي يستاك به كالمسواك. So what's the siwak? He says siwak is بكسر السين, أي siwak, not sawak. He says وهو العود, so it's the stick which is used يستاك به, i.e. which used to brush. He says كالمسواك, which is called a miswak. He says واسم للاستياك أيضا. So he says it's also used now, the siwak, so it has two meanings. So it's a word which is mushtarak, right? Mushtarak means that it's shared. There's multiple possible meanings for this particular thing, just like you have the word spring, and spring could be that springy thing that children play with, or it can be a spring of water, right? So for example, so it's there's multiple meanings to this one thing. So that's why he says istiyak. Istiyak is brushing. So yustaku bihi. So it's the actual stick which you use to brush with, or it's the act of brushing itself. Right. So these are two meanings. He says وهو المراد بعبارة الفقهاء. So what's intended by the statements of the fuqaha? It's this second meaning, i.e. the idea of brushing. Istiyak, brushing. لأنه يقال ساك فاه يسوكه إذا دلكه بالمسواك وإذا لم يذكر الفم يقال استاك. So you're just saying, you're just giving the kind of to get the morphology of the word. So he says ساك فاه يسوكه, which is just how you would express it. إذا دلكه بالمسواك, if he brushes it with a toothstick. It says وإذا لم يذكر الفم يقال استاك, and if you don't mention the fam, fahu, of course, is just how you express it when in those in that context. I mean, the fa is just it's in reference to the fam, right? It's just how it manifests in sentences. So he says, you would say استاك. قال في مختار الصحاح السواك المسواك. So مختار الصحاح, of course, this is by al-Razi now, was also the sahib of the تحفة الملوك, so it's actually a Hanafi dictionary. So he says السواك والمسواك. قال أبو زيد جمعه سوق أو سبك, sorry. He says مثل كتاب وكتب. Remember, this is the whole thing is ta'rif, like we're just looking at the word itself, right? So that's why he's going back to the dictionaries. So he's telling you, okay, how do you say it in a plural form, for example, how do you express it in a sentence, and so on and so forth. That's what he's done so far. So كتاب وكتب وسوى كفاه تسويكا. وإذا قلت استاك وتسوك لم تذكر الفم انتهى بحروفه. So if you say istaka, which is what he said before, then you wouldn't mention the fam, right? You wouldn't mention the mouth, right? You only mention the mouth with certain forms of this verb. So if you say istaka or tasawwaka, then it's you don't need to mention the mouth, which is what also he was saying with this form of it as well. وقال في القاموس ساك الشيء دلكه. So what does it mean? Saka, which is what he said over here, sakafahu, right? So saka shay, that it means to rub something. دلكه, to rub it. وفمه بالعود. وسوكه تسويكا. واستاك وتسوك. ولا يذكر العود ولا الفم معهما. So you don't mention in istaka وتسوك, you don't mention the stick either. It's understood. He says والعود مسواك وسواك بكسرهما ويذكر. So the tooth stick now, he says it's called miswak and siwak. This is how we started today. We said that siwak, and he gave us the two options, right? He said that it's mushtarak, that it means this, it means that. So here you can see in the major Islamic dictionary, so of course the Qamus al-Muhit over here, the Mukhtar al-Sihah, like these are all references to significant dictionaries. Okay. So he says, وقال في غاية البيان. غاية البيان being the sharh of the Hidayah. Right? So Amir Katib al-Atqani was a sharh of the Hidayah. It's actually printed now in about 17 volumes or something. So he says, وَالسِّوَاكُ أي استعماله sunnah. So he expresses now that the usage, i.e. that using the toothstick, as it were, using the toothstick means what? Brushing your teeth. He said this is a sunnah. He says لأن الخشبة التي تسمى سواكا ومسواكا أيضا ليست بسنة. He says because the wood, i.e. the piece of wood, i.e. this wooden toothstick, at least in ancient times, you'd have the wooden toothstick. I say in ancient times like it doesn't exist now, but I'm just trying to make the point. تسمى سواك, which is called the siwak or the miswak as well. He's saying this is not a sunnah. Right, this is not a sunnah. Remember, I said as we're getting into this, you have to take out everything from your mind. So you're learning for the first time what exactly this thing is, and what exactly the sunnah is. And that's when it's going to make sense to you. Otherwise, it's just going to confuse yourself. So he says, laysat bi sunnah. So what's the sunnah? Brushing your teeth. What's not the sunnah? Using the specific wooden toothstick. That's what he said so far. He says, وَحُذِفَ الْمُضَافُ لِأَمْنِ اللَّبْسِ. So he says, so the mudaf now has been hidden. He says because there's a lack of because there's no confusion. Right? There's no confusion. He says كما في قوله صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم خير خلال الصائم السواك أي استعماله انتهى ببعض تصرف. Somebody has a hand up. Yeah, Hassan, you'll have to post your question because there's no mic option. So he says خير خلال الصائم السواك. So the best of the traits of the faster is brushing the teeth. So it says here, i.e. استعماله استعمال using a toothbrush, right, to brush your teeth. So he says there's a little change from the غاية over here. وكلام ابن مالك يميل إلى هذا. قال في شرح الوقاية. Okay, so now he says in شرح الوقاية والسواك أي استعماله وهو اسم الخشبة المرة المعينة للاستياك. So he says the siwak, i.e. using it, i.e. so brushing your teeth. Again, that's what he is. So whenever he says isti'mal, he means brushing your teeth. He says it's also used now to refer to the bitter wooden stick, i.e. toothstick, which is specified for this, i.e. that they make this thing and that's what you use to brush your teeth. Right? So he says this is also called a siwak. In regards to the line laysat bisunnah, that's wondering, is this risala considered very authoritative work in the madhab on this topic? I'm guessing yes. I mean, it depends what you mean by authoritative, because is his lubab authoritative? Is his other works authoritative? I mean, he's a late scholar, so he's gathering now what the ulama have said about this. So I mean, al-Ghani is definitely authoritative, and that's whom he was quoting. So even if he's not necessarily saying it himself, the commentators on the Hidayah, these are some of the great commentators on the Hidayah who have actually mentioned this, and that's what he's expressing over here, at least from one of those commentators. He says, وقال القهستاني في كتابه جامع الرموز عند قول الماتن وسننه السواك أي الاستياك كما في المقاييس فلا حذف. Again, right now, remember, it's a linguistic discussion. So he's still talking about the idea of whether the mudaf is hidden, i.e. what's mudaf? Isti'mal, i.e. isti'mal as-siwak, or just saying siwak, like how are they using it? This is what he's talking about. So he says here, كما في المقاييس, مقاييس again, مقاييس اللغة. This is also a very important dictionary. So he says, so there's no hadf here. He says, وقال في نور الإيضاح والسواك قال الشارح بكسر السين اسم للاستياك, استياك again being the act of brushing, وللعود أيضا, and also the stick, again expressing that it's used for both. He says والمراد الأول انتهى. Yeah, so what's intended in the statement when the shari in Nur al-Idah, when he says wasiwak, what's intended? Brushing your teeth. Right, that's what's intended. He says انتهى. قال المحشي قوله والمراد الأول أي فلا حاجة إلى تقدير مضاف. انتهى. You don't have to say استعمال. Right? Again, remember, it's just linguistics right now. I don't want anyone to get like confused, like they don't know what's happening. He's just talking about the expression of the word now. So he defined it and everything, and then he's talking about how the fuqaha are using it. Then he's trying to emphasize this idea of whether or not you have to affirm that there's a mudaf which has been hidden. So he's saying no, saying siwak alone is sufficient. So he says قال في الكنز. Yeah, can someone make their own toothstick using nature outside today, like small stick for brushing your teeth? Would it be a sunnah? Do you need spit? Okay, just hold on to your horses with that question, because we're still defining it yet, and we have to read the rest of the risala yet. But if you don't get an answer by the end, then you can just remind me of your question. قال في الكنز وسواكه قال في البحر of Ibn Nujaym now أي استعماله لأنه اسم للخشبة كذا في الشروح ولا حاجة إليه لأن السواك يأتي بمعنى المصدر أيضا. And so he says, so in the shuruh they say استعمال السواك. So he says there's no need to do that. Why? Because the siwak يأتي بمعنى المصدر, which is what? Which is brushing. كما ذكره Ibn Faris في مقاييس اللغة, which we just saw earlier as well. Right? What did he say here? الاستياك, right? Which is brushing. So he's saying this already established lughatan. You don't have to say استعمال, because these commentators are saying استعمال. He says انتهى فقد علم أنه لا حذف وإن وهم بعض الشراح كما بين ذلك آنفا فتأمل. Right, so that's his khulasa now. After all of that, looking at dictionaries and looking at fuqaha, what the fuqaha are saying, and then even showing now fuqaha saying the same thing, that you don't have to affirm that anything has been hidden. Rather, it's fine. The masdar has both meanings, and what they mean is the first one, and that's it. So he says, even though some of the commentators said that you have to do hadf, that it has been hadf, and so on and so forth, he said, but again, that's just a linguistic thing. Okay, so now he says, he gives us the hukm. Remember, he's in the ta'rif now. So everybody knows now what siwak means. That's the first mabhath. So hopefully by this point, nobody's just lost, that you know what it means. You know what the word siwak means. So he says, وَهُوَ سُنَّةٌ مُؤَكَّدَةٌ. So this is now the hukm of it, بِدَلِيلِ مُوَاظَبَتِهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. So he says, so this is the second thing now that he wants to talk about, which is the idea that it is considered to be an emphasized sunnah because the Prophet ﷺ, this was a part of his invariable practice, that he would always do this act. So he says, قال في الهداية لأنه عليه الصلاة والسلام كان يواظب عليه. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام used to do this all the time without fail. قال العيني أي لأن النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم كان يواظب على استعمال السواك. So Badruddin al-Aini now explains this. So he says that the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام used to do this regularly. I use the siwak. والعجب من المصنف رحمه الله تعالى أنه ذكر أن استعمال السواك سنة ثم احتج على ذلك بمواظبة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. So he says that it's a bit strange that the author, i.e. صاحب al-Hidayah here, that he says that it's a sunnah, and then he expresses that the Prophet ﷺ used to do this without fail, i.e. that it was part of his regular practice. He says, وَمَعَ هَذَا لَمْ يَذْكُرْ شَيْئًا مِنَ الْأَحَادِيثَ الدَّالَّةِ عَلَى الْمُوَاظَبَةِ. And then he didn't mention anything which indicates muwaظبة. Right? وقد علم أن المواظبة منه صلى الله عليه وسلم على فعل شيء تدل على الوجوب. So this is now an angle to this issue, which is that the muwaظبة normally indicates wujub. If you say muwaظبة or واظب صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم على شيء, this indication that this matter is considered to be a wajib, not a sunnah. So he says, وقد اعتذر عنه الشراح بأن المواظبة مع الترك دليل السنية. So he says, so the commentators, what did they do? They made an excuse basically for Sahib al-Hidayah and said that because that it was left sometimes, this is an indication that it's actually considered to be a sunnah. وبدونه دليل الوجوب. And without this, it is a proof of being wajib. وقد دل على تركه حديث الأعرابي فإنه لم ينقل فيه تعليم السواك. So in the hadith where the Bedouin is taught how to perform the wudu, what's not transmitted to him and what's not transmitted to us in terms of that transmission of or that event of the teaching of the this Bedouin man, there's no mention of the siwak. فلو كان واجبا لعلمه. So were it a wajib, the Prophet ﷺ would have informed him or instructed him to do it at that time. And we would have known thereby that it's required. قال الأكمل, so أكمل الدين البابرتي, ويستدل بترك التعليم, of course he's also a commentator on the Hidayah, ويستدل بترك التعليم على عدم الوجوب دفعا للتعارض. So he says the lack of teaching or instruction indicates now that it's not a wajib. He says that this is the proof that we use. He says in order to ward off any type of contradiction. He says فإن عدم الترك يدل على الوجوب, because not and it's not being left indicates that it's mandatory. وترك التعليم يدل على عدمه, which is the opposite now. That's what he just said. Whereas that it's not being instructed now, that it not being taught to the Bedouin, is a sign that it was not a requirement, which is the nature of what it means for something to be a wajib. انتهى بتصرف. So he says this, tasarruf means that he might have done something to the ibarah, might have shortened something and so on. It says ويدل على السنية أيضا ذكر المتون لأن غالب المتون ذكرت السواك في أول السنن. So what also indicates the fact that it's a sunnah. So once he started by saying that it was a sunnah mu'akkada. Then he mentioned Sahib al-Hidayah's reasoning, but then he brought out what the commentators have said about this reasoning, because the reasoning is, there's issues with that line of reasoning. So now he's resolved the idea that it's not a wajib. So now he's gone back to re-emphasize the idea that it's a sunnah by saying that this is what the mutun have also mentioned, and this is the asl when it comes to the mutun, that they are there to transmit madhab. So he says most of them mentioned the siwak at the beginning of the section on sunnahs. لكن صاحب الهداية قال الأصح أنه مستحب وكذلك صاحب المشكات. So he says that صاحب الهداية, he actually mentioned that the sounder position with respect to it is that it is a recommended act, i.e. not a sunnah mu'akkada, but it's only mustahab. He says وكذلك صاحب المشكات. It's not clear to me why Sahib al-Mishkat is being mentioned over here. Purely incidentally, Sahib al-Mishkat is a Tabrizi, but I'm not sure why he's being mentioned over here, other than the fact that perhaps he's referencing like the muhaddithin, which again wouldn't necessarily make so much sense. Yeah, that's the other option, that it could be a sharh, I like, for example, the famous sharh of Mullah Ali al-Qari on the Mishkat. So that's a possibility. But then there's either some type of saqt, or it's just like a sabaq qalam or something, a slip of the pen, or there's something which is missing over here. But perhaps I'm mistaken. Perhaps somebody else knows something about some Hanafi book that's called the Mishkat. I can't think of anything myself. So he says, وَالْحَدِيثُ يُقَوِّي السُنِّةِ. Anyway, it's not important. The important thing now is that Sahib al-Hidayah considers it to be a recommended sunnah. He says, وَالْحَدِيثُ يُقَوِّي السُنِّيَّةِ وَهُوَ قَوْلُهُ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. So now what's he doing? Now he gets into a discussion from the perspective of the hadiths. And really, this is just isti'nas, because he's not a mujtahid, and he is doing this just to kind of show that even based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, if we were to try to understand what's happening, at least the zahir of them would give precedence to the idea that it's a sunnah, rather than not being that important and an emphasized sunnah, rather than being something lesser than that. So we'll read this, and then inshallah I'll mention something about the hidayah. So he says, وهو قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لولا أن أشق على أمتي أو على الناس لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. That I don't deem it to be difficult. Why not to deem it to be difficult for my ummah or for people? I would have instructed them to brush their teeth for every prayer, right? For every prayer. It says هذا لفظ مسلم ورواية البخاري مع كل صلاة. أخرجاه من حديث أبي هريرة. So he says here it's عند كل صلاة, at the time of every prayer, and this one is with every prayer. It says وأخرجها النسائي عنه عند كل وضوء. So النسائي says with every wudu, at the time of every wudu. وأخرجها ابن حبان في صحيحه وابن خزيمة والحاكم من طريق آخر وعلقها البخاري. Right, that it's in one of his معلقات. So he says here that عند كل وضوء is in all of these types of places. He says وروى أبو حنيفة عن أبي يعلى عن تمام أو أبي تمام عن جعفر ابن أبي طالب أو العباس ibn Abd al-Muttalib. And of course, you can read the discussion, which I'm not going to get into right now, of Sheikh Abdul Fattah with respect to the one of the narrators of this in this particular chain. It says عن النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم قال ما لي أراكم تدخلون عليه قلحا استاكوا فلولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم أن يستاكوا عند كل صلاة وفي رواية عند كل وضوء. Yeah, so why do I see you coming to me yellow-teethed? Right, so he says, so brush your teeth, and were I not to deem it difficult for my ummah, for my community, I would have instructed them to brush their teeth for every prayer. He says, and also, so also عند كل وضوء, and the time of making wudu. ويقوي السنية, he says, so he says ويقوي السنية أيضا ما ورد أيضا أن كل صلاة به تفضل 70 صلاة بدونه. So what also strengthens the idea of sunnah, it being a sunnah, is what's been transmitted, that every prayer, in which the person has brushed their teeth is 70 times superior to a prayer which is prayed without it. He says, وقد قال محمد ibn أبي العز في التنبيه على مشكلات الهداية قوله في السواك والأصح أنه مستحب مشكل. So Ibn Abi al-Izz mentions in his Tanbih ala Mushkilat al-Hidayah, what does he say? He says, when he's talking about what Sahib al-Hidayah has stated with respect to this issue now. So where Sahib al-Hidayah said it was mustahab, he says it's mushkil. Right? He said this is problematic. He says, بل الأصح أنه سنة مؤكدة. He said, but the sound position is that it's actually considered to be an emphasized sunnah. لحث النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم أكثرت عليكم في السواك أخرجه البخاري. انتهى. So he mentions that that the sounder position is that it's an emphasized sunnah. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ encouraged it quite strongly. He says, أكثرت عليكم في السواك, that I've instructed and encouraged you quite strongly, and I guess multiple times, to use to brush your teeth. So أكثرت عليكم في السواك. So it's وكلام الحلبي في شرح المنية يقوي الاستحباب. So al-Halabi now in شرح المنية. Ibrahim, this is Sheikh Ibrahim al-Halabi. In his Halabi Kabir, right? So Halabi Kabir. Most likely it's the Kabir. It's possible that it's the Saghir as well. Of course, the Saghir is only in Ikhtisar, but the asl would be that it's the larger one. So يقوي الاستحباب لأنه قال ومن الآداب أن يستاك. ثم قال بعد نقل عبارة الهداية واستدل ابن الهمام على الاستحباب بأنه لم يرد حديث صريح بمواظبته صلى الله عليه وسلم على ذلك انتهى بتصرف. So what he says now in his work, it strengthens the idea of istihbab. He says, because from the adab to brush your teeth, and then after mentioning what Sahib al-Hidayah said, because he says that it's mustahab, he says, he mentions what Ibn al-Humam has to say about it, who says that there's no clear, explicit hadith which indicates the muwadhaba of the Prophet ﷺ, i.e. that he consistently engaged in this practice. So he says, intaha bitasarruf, again, with slight, with I guess some editing. This is Maydani's quote from Halabi. He says, لكن رواية سيدة عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها كنا نعد لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم سواكه وطهوره. That we prepare for the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام his siwak and also his, i.e. the water and the like that he would be using for purificatory purposes. فيبعثه الله ما شاء أن يبعثه. He says فيتسوك ويتوضأ ويصلي دليل على أنه كان ذلك عادته عليه الصلاة والسلام. So he mentions now that this hadith of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, we say that Aisha mentions this idea of how we would prepare this with along with everything else for the wudu of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. And then this is how he would perform his wudu. فيتسوك ويتوضأ ويصلي. So he says that this indicates that it was his practice. وروي أيضا من حديث السيدة عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها أن النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم كان لا يرقد من ليل ولا نهار فيستيقظ إلا تسوك قبل أن يتوضأ. Yeah, so he wouldn't lay down and then arise or awaken, except that he would brush his teeth before performing the wudu. وقد وفق بعضهم بين السنية والاستحباب بأنه سنة في ابتداء الوضوء مستحب فيما سوى ذلك. So how are they resolving this now? Because it seems there's contradictions here. So some of the ulama said that it's a sunnah in the wudu and it's recommended thereafter. So this is how they resolved it. So وحكي عن إسحاق ibn راهوي أنه واجب إن تركه عمدا بطلت صلاته. So Ishaq, one of the early mujtahideen, what did he say? He says, wajib. If you deliberately omit it, your prayer is invalid. He says, وَقَدْ أَوْجَبَهُ داود أيضا. Dawood al-Zahiri also made it a wajib. So you can see how that the literalists, at the literalist side of the spectrum now, in terms of the madhabs, they took these hadiths very, very literally. No pun intended. But they obviously they took those hadiths at face value and then mandated the usage of it. He says, حتى نقل عنه بطلان الصلاة بتركه. This a similar type of thing, that if you leave it deliberately, then the person's prayer would be invalidated. واحتج كل من داود وذن راهوي للوجوب بظاهر قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم عليكم بالسواك. Right. So what did they do? They used this as a basis, i.e. that make sure you brush your teeth. وقوله عليه الصلاة والسلام استاكوا. Again, a clear command to brush your teeth. وبما روي عن سعيد افترضت عليهم السواك مع كل وضوء وروي مع كل طهور. Yeah. So different riwayat indicating again that the mandatory nature of brushing the teeth, right, at the point of purification. قال العيني ذكره في الإمام وخرجه أحمد أيضا. So he mentioned it in the Imam, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. And he says, and Ahmad also transmitted this riwayat. So you can see there's many riwayat which are clear in terms of there being a command. ورد عليهما بقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. So how do you respond to these? Then the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام saying that what we talked about before, that were I not fearful of making things difficult for my ummah, I would have commanded them. Right? So this is the response now to those other hadiths. Yeah, I can't wait to tell my kids. نفى الأمر به للمشقة فينفي الوجوب لذلك. Right, so he said that he negated now the command because of mashaqqa, which is basically a haraj, right, some form of difficulty. So he says, so the wujub, any type of it being, any sense of it being mandatory would be warded off thereby. فَثَبَتَ مَا دُونَ الْوَاجِبِ وَهُوَ السُّنَّةِ. So what's established then is that which is less than a wajib, which is a sunnah. لعدم المانع وهو المشقة. Because there's no harm, there's no preventive from saying something like that. So he says, so this would be like mashaqqa, because that's what took it down basically. He does actually want to carry on a little bit now. I'll make one final point, and then inshallah we'll have a short break for Maghrib over here, and then we'll resume. So like I said before, this is almost like a kind of istihsan. So he's sorry, istinas. So in the sense that he's considering the hadiths of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he's making like a hadith argument, right? In light of the fact that Dawood has said something and Ishaq said something, so he's kind of responding to that. He's also looking at the idea of the sunnah mustahab simply from the perspective that the perspective of hadith alone. So hadith alone. But of course, that's not the although the fuqaha have these types of they will have this hadithi engagement and the like, but that's not the only thing. We also have to consider the general asl when it comes to this type of thing, and the different there's a different way of considering the idea of siwak in the various sub-schools. Actually, this is why within the madhab, and this is why Sahib al-Hidayah is saying what he is saying versus other mutun, sometimes just expressing it as it is, and as it's kind of been transmitted, just simply saying it's like a sunnah. Where Sahib al-Hidayah being a bit more expressive, and this is coming from differing manahij. So with respect to how Quduri, Imam Quduri, for example, that how he is considering, what does this mean? Again, you really remember, I've mentioned this before, that these Rasa'i'l readings are supposed to be supplementary. So supplementary to your study. So inshallah, you'll study with your teachers in your classes some of these types of things when it comes to, inshallah, you look at the usul and the underlying rationale and the ma'ani and the logic of those various abwab. But also it's important to consider the various sub-schools and why Sahib al-Hidayah, for example, is saying one thing. And really, the section on the sunnahs of wudu has a certain logic according to one, like almost like one sub-school, and a different sub-school has a different logic to it. And so Sahib al-Hidayah is expressing that logic, right? Which is what? Which that, look, this is not intrinsic to the wudu. This is just a general sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And because he did it in all of these different ahwal, which is something that we'll see very shortly, which is why there's the next point, or whether it's a sunnah of the deen or sunnah of the wudu and the like. This is why Sahib al-Hidayah says that, look, this is not specific to the wudu. If it's not specific to the wudu, then it can't possibly be a sunnah mu'akkada. That's basically the thinking behind it. And there's also a different perspective, which is almost like the other perspective of it, in the sense that it's been transmitted as something which is to be done, right, at the time of wudu. So that's a different way of considering. So that's a completely different logic when it comes to the sunnahs of wudu. So this logic is very different to that logic. And if it seems the same, then you might need to re-listen to this recording again. But inshallah, if you go back to your own studies and the like, then some of these things will be clarified to you. But it's not so straightforward. Imam Quduri has his own method with respect to that school. That sub-school, that Iraqi sub-school, has a certain method when it comes to a certain logic and a certain fahm when it comes to the sunnahs of wudu, and Sahib al-Hidayah doesn't subscribe to those same premises. And he's Samarqandi and he's saying something else, right? So the sub-school is saying one thing, the sub-school is saying something else. So it's only when you are on one side or the other, you can end up doing this almost like a tarjih, where you end up saying, okay, well, it must be like Sunnah Mu'akkada. So I'm sitting on the Sunnah Mu'akkada side, then I can just bring out the stuff and say that Sahib al-Hidayah, that's his position, but actually the position of the madhab is that it's a Sunnah Mu'akkada. Whereas really, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Okay, so inshallah, we'll take a short break and we'll be back in about 5 minutes time. Barakallahu feekum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So inshallah we'll be carrying on with our reading. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So just to briefly recap now, we first looked at the ta'rif. Right? We're still in the muqaddimah. In the muqaddimah, in this introductory paragraph, he wants to look at firstly the definition of the siwak, which is what we've done now, and secondly the hukam of it. In the discussion of the hukam, he's now talked about the hadiths as well. So talked about the hadiths and how to resolve the apparent conflict which is present within the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, and how we arrived at the idea of Sunniyah, and then also considering the position of Sahib al-Hidayah as well, of course upheld by others. It's not only Sahib al-Hidayah, but it's the idea that the brushing your teeth is recommended, that it's not a sunnah mu'akkada. Of course, that has implications. Of course, something which is recommended is still a sunnah. It's just a different type of sunnah. So, and everything which is a sunnah is something which is expected of the mukallaf, but the implication of it being recommended rather than a sunnah is significant, in the sense that he wouldn't necessarily have done something makruh, right? So he might miss the fadl and the like, which is still associated with it, but these are two separate things. Any associated merit is secondary, right? So in the sense that, of course, there's a fadl if you engage in this recommended act, but at the end of the day, if you don't, then of course you miss the fadl. But the fadl is not what defines the level of the hukam. So he says, واختلف العلماء هل السواك من سنن الوضوء أو من سنن الصلاة أو من سنن الدين. So the ulama, they differed as to whether brushing now is from the sunnahs of wudu, the sunnahs of the prayer, or the sunnahs of deen, i.e. just generally speaking. فقال بعضهم من سنن الوضوء وأورد أحاديث منها ما رواه مالك عن ابن أبي الزناد عن الأعرج عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال عليه الصلاة والسلام لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك مع كل وضوء. Of course, we've seen this hadith now a number of times. So this first position, some of the ulama said it's from the sunnahs of wudu. So he mentioned the hadith now, which is from, I guess, narrated in the Muwatta. And it's a hadith which we've seen a number of times. He says, وعن مالك مرفوعا ورواه ابن خزيمة في صحيحه والنساء والدارقطني مرفوعا إلى النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم السواك مع كل وضوء. So this is now indicating the same thing, right? Because remember, this first position is the idea of the sunnah, that it being a sunnah of the wudu. وروى البيهقي من حديث مالك بن أنس عن ابن شهاب عن حميد بن عبد الرحمن بن عوف عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم قال لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك مع كل وضوء. Again, indicating the same thing. وأكثر الرواة عن مالك هكذا مرفوعا. Yeah. So you can see that even Sheikh Abd al-Fattah, he says here that وَلَعَلَّهُ عن مالك رواه هكذا مرفوعا. So I'm saying there might be something missing here to make it make sense, but the idea is that most of the ruwa, they transmitted it from Malik like this. And that is specifically seems to be about the wudu. وقال بعضهم من سنن الصلاة, and some of them said it's from the sunnahs of the salat. وأورد أحاديث منها ما رواه ستة في كتبهم عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك مع كل صلاة. وقال مسلم عند كل صلاة. So you can see that these riwayas of it, which are the same riwayat which he talked about earlier, but here they are mentioning the salat instead of the wudu. وروى أبو داود والترمذي من حديث أبي سلمة عن زيد بن خالد الجهني مرفوعا قال لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. وقال الترمذي حديث حسن صحيح. Yeah, so you can see the same thing again about the salat. قال العيني فإن قلت كيف التوفيق بين رواية كل وضوء ورواية كل صلاة. So this is what he also mentioned earlier, that how do we join now between these apparently contradicting hadiths, like some of them saying that it's عند صلاة and some of them saying عند الوضوء. So he says قلت السواك الواقع عند الوضوء عند الوضوء واقع للصلاة، لأن الوضوء شرع لها فتحمل الأحاديث التي فيها عند كل صلاة على ما ذكرنا توفيقا بين الأحاديث، ولأن السواك عند صلاة ربما جرح الفم وأخرج الدم وهو نجس بلا خلاف، وإن كان خلاف في انتقاض الوضوء به فيجتنب عن ذلك. انتهى. So Badruddin al-Aini now, what does he say? He says that when you do it for the salat, then it's, when you do it in the wudu, then it's done really for the salat. So he says, so the wudu, he says, because the wudu has been legislated for the salat. So the hadiths which say now, عند كل صلاة, they are interpreted as done in the wudu, like for the salat. So he says this is how you join between the different hadiths. He says, and also because brushing the teeth at the time of the prayer, it could injure the mouth, that you could make your gums bleed. Right? It says, so it might make blood come out. And he says this is filthy, that everybody agrees that this is filthy, even though there's some disagreement about whether or not this invalidates your wudu. Of course, not in our madhab, but in terms of the madhabs disagree about this. فيجتنب عن ذلك, so he says, in order to avoid this situation where you injure yourself or you cause your gums to bleed and the like, then he says you should avoid this. So this is how he resolved the apparent contradiction. So that which happens at the wudu is happening really for the salat. So when it's mentioned the salat, it means to do it for the salat. When do you do it? You do it in the wudu for the salat. He says, وَقَالَ بَعْضُهُمْ وَمِن سُنَنِ الدِّينِ. Right, so it's the sunnahs of deen generally speaking. There's just a general sunnah. Brushing your teeth is a general sunnah. It's not specific to the wudu, nor is it specific to the salat. So he says, وَهُوَ الْمَنْقُولُ عَنْ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ. So he says this is what's transmitted also from Imam Abu Hanifa رضي الله تعالى عنه لأنه قال رضي الله تعالى عنه السواك من سنن الدين. So it's transmitted from him that brushing the teeth is from the sunnahs of deen. ووردت أحاديث تدل على ذلك, and we have hadiths which indicate that. منها ما رواه أحمد والترمذي من حديث أبي أيوب رضي الله عنه 4 من سنن المرسلين الختان والسواك والتعطر والنكاح. So in hadiths transmitted by Imam Ahmad and Tirmidhi, he says that 4 things are from the sunnahs of the messengers, alayhim salatu wasalam: circumcision, brushing the teeth, perfuming oneself, and marriage. Right, marriage. So these are the 4 things. So he says that, look, this is just a general sunnah. It's just a general thing which is done. He says, وَمِنْهَا مَا رواه مسلم من حديث سيدة عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها 10 من الفطرة فذكر منها السواك. So again, you have in the hadith al-fitra by Sayyida Aisha رضي الله تعالى عنها, one of the things that she mentions, brushing your teeth again. So it's not specific then to the wudu, it's not specific to the salat. ومنها ما رواه البزار من حديث أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه الطهارات 4: قص الشارب وحلق العانة وتقليم الأظافر أو أظفار والسواك. So he says the matters of purification purifications of four types. He says trimming the mustache and shaving the pubic hairs and trimming one's nails and brushing one's teeth. ومنها ما رواه الطبراني والبيهقي من حديث أم سلمة رضي الله تعالى عنها مرفوعا ما زال جبريل يوصيني بالسواك الحديث. Right, so in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, mentioning that Sayyidina Jibreel is continuing to emphasize the importance of brushing teeth. ومنها ما رواه البيهقي من حديث عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها هن لكم سنة وعلي فريضة السواك والوتر وقيام الليل. So he says, so in this hadith, Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha transmit that these things are sunnah for you, but they are obligatory for me. I.e. the Prophet ﷺ, again, brushing the teeth, praying the witr prayer, and praying the night prayers, قيام الليل. ومنها ما رواه أحمد والطبراني من حديث واثلة ابن الأسقع أمرت بالسواك حتى خشيت أن يكتب علي. Is that I was commanded to brush teeth until I feared that it would be written against me, i.e. that it would become an obligation on me. Right? Again, you can see the sense of how important it is and how much emphasis was being given to this idea of brushing teeth. He says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ يُسْتَحَبُّ فِي حَالَاتٍ. So now that's the end of his discussion on the hukam and the related hadiths, and a side discussion with respect to whether it's a sunnah of the deen or the salat or the wudu. And then he just mentions that it's recommended at certain times. منها عدم عند تغير الفم. So when there's a change in the mouth, you change like the mouth, there's a smell in the mouth, for example. So it might be after not eating for a certain period of time or after eating. وعند القيام من النوم. And he says, and after rising from sleep. ومنها عند الاجتماع مع الناس, and then when gathering and being with people. كيوم عرفة والمزدلفة ورمي الجمار وصلاة عيد وغير ذلك. So you can see that all of these are occasions of gathering. So the occasions of gathering are occasions when you would ensure that you brush your teeth. So he says, like the day of Arafah, you're gathering on the plains of Arafat, and then Muzdalifah, gathering Muzdalifat, Rami al-Jimar, gathering around the area of pelting, Salat al-Eid, gathering on the plains of where Salat al-Eid will be prayed, وغير ذلك, and the like. ومنها عند القيام إلى الصلاة. So he says, and also when intending to pray, إذا لم يكن مستاكا عند الوضوء. So he says, so if he did not use a siwak at the time of wudu, وأمن من خروج الدم, and he is sure, reasonably sure, that it won't cause his gums to bleed and the like, because then of course there's no point, because it just ruins your wudu and then you won't be able to pray. It says وإذا لم يأمن فلا يستحب. So he says, if he's not, of course, if he's not sure about it, there's a likelihood, for example, or perhaps if he's not even sure, then he might err on the side of caution, in which case it is not considered to be recommended for such an individual to use it. He says, وَمِنْهَا عِنْدَ قِرَاءَةِ الْقُرْآنِ وَالْحَدِيثِ. Similarly, when somebody is going to recite the Quran or recite the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. Again, why is this important? Remember, the point is, it's not just the thing to remember in this entire discussion right now, although we have a lot to come now, is that it's not a symbolic gesture. There is a ma'na behind this. Right? That ma'na will become clearer as we proceed on now. But it's not just a symbolic thing. So you just have like something, you just stick it in your mouth and you say, okay, I brush my teeth and the qira'at al-Quran. That's not how it works. That's not the purpose or function of it. So inshallah, we'll see the details as they come in the next section now. Could there also be a lot of emphasis on brushing your teeth because they didn't have fillings? Not necessarily. But let's see what else he says now. He says, فَإِذَا قَالَ الْغَنَائِ. Was Wana'i here not is not Hanafi, but he just mentions it as a fa'idah because remember he said at the beginning that I'm mentioning this from the fuqaha and the muhaddithin. So he says يجب السواك على المرأة إذا أمرها زوجها. So he says it becomes mandatory upon a lady to brush her teeth if her husband instructs her to do so. وعلى الأمة والعبد إذا أمرهما السيد. And similarly, a female slave or male slave, if their master instructs them to do so. وعلى من تغير فمه من أكل الثوم والبصل. So he says similarly, somebody whose mouth odor has changed now as a result of eating something of garlic or onions or the like, i.e. those in a raw state, not necessarily in other state. He says أو من مص الدخان, i.e. from sucking like a cigarette, وأراد دخول المسجد, and they intend thereby, i.e. thereafter, to enter into a mosque. So what do you do then? You ensure you rinse out your mouth and you brush your teeth and so on to rid yourself of that foul odor. Right, so this is just a general point over here. It's just a general fa'idah that he's mentioning over here. But otherwise, تغير رائحة الفم and the like. Of course, there might be a stronger emphasis, but there's other ahkam as well. We don't simply take them from something like this, because the madhab also has some of these issues are detailed out, but sometimes just like a random fa'idah, you find something together nicely. He's just put it in there. Okay, so he says al-bab al-awwalu fi waqtihi. So the first chapter now, or the first section on its waqt. So of course, even his muqaddimah was quite significant. He talked about a lot. It wasn't exactly a short muqaddimah. Could have just been bab al-awwal really, and his muqaddimah could have been something a bit shorter. But anyway. And we'll see his Bab al-Awwal is probably not, it's nowhere near as long as his Muqaddimah. So with respect to its time, so when do you actually brush your teeth now? So he says وقت السواك عند الوضوء. So don't forget, of course, what he just mentioned before. Those are just general recommendations. Like there's just the general adab of the Sharia, in the sense that when you wake up in the morning, when you go to sleep at night, it's general following of the Prophet ﷺ. It's from the min adab al-Islam, so to speak. It's just the adab of Islam. It's just the adab of a mu'min. As for the specific hukm shar'i and all of its specific fadail and merits and the like, they are associated with with the prayer, really. I mean, that's the context of what he's talking about. This is the only time where it's specifically mandated, right? In the sense, this is why we determined from the discussion which we had that it was a sunnah mu'akkada. So this is why all he's going to talk about really is just the wudu. He says, وَقْتُ السِّوَاكِ عِنْدَ الْوُضُوء. So the time now of brushing is when somebody is performing the wudu. He says, وَقَبْلَ الْوُضُوء, also before the wudu. قال في الكفاية أي شرح عند الهداية وأما وقته يعني السواك عند الوضوء وذكر في تحفة الفقهاء so of علاء الدين السمرقندي وزاد الفقهاء الاسبجابي أنه سنة حالة المضمضة. So he says now that in the kifaya, what does he say? الكرلاني الخارزمي, he says وقته عند الوضوء. So he says عند الوضوء. تحفة الفقهاء, they say when? حالة المضمضة. حالة المضمضة is when you're rinsing out the mouth. Right, so this is the time for the siwak. وذكر شيخ الإسلام في موسوطه أن من السنة حالة المضمضة أن يستاك. So again, emphasize now in the Kharzada in his مبسوط, emphasizing that this is the time for it. He says وقال سيدي الوادد في شرحه على القدور عند قول الماتن والسواك أي الاستياك عند المضمضة وقيل قبلها انتهى. So you can see here that هذا المقطع مقحم على الرسالة من ابن المؤلف. So of course the son ʿAbd al-Ghani al-Maydani, his son was also an alim, right? He was also a sheikh, and he studied at the hands of his father. So it seems that this seems to be some type of idraj, that he's kind of put it into the risala over here, just in terms of how it's phrased here. Of course, Maydani is not going to say that he's not talking about his father. Rather, the son is talking about Maydani himself. And that's why he says, my father said in his sharh on Quduri Aid al-Ubab, where the author says siwak, he says brushing at the time of madmada, rinsing out the mouth, and it's also said before this point, intaha. So again, emphasizing that this is the time according to that position. وفي الدراية ثم وقته عند المضمضة انتهى. وفي كفاية المنتهي والوسيلة والشفاء يستاك قبل الوضوء وقال العيني وقت. Of course, this is yeah, I mean, he mentions this. Badruddin al-Aini, I think, is the one who actually quotes this, but it seems like a bit of a generic kind of nos. I don't think it's Shifa. Could be Qadi Iyad Shifa. I don't know the wasila really what it is, but if somebody has any clarity, then please do let us know. He says يستاك قبل الوضوء. So he says before the wudu. وقال العيني وقت استعماله في الوضوء ذكره في المحيط وشرح مختصر الكرخي والطحاوي والتحفة والنافع أي الفقه النافع of السمرقندي. So so you can see that there's a lot of texts, a lot of books are actually saying that its time is during the wudu, and the حالة المضمضة is what he has affirmed. He says فعلى كل فهو للوضوء. So he says, yeah, so he says, so in some, then it is for the wudu. فإذا نسيه عند المضمضة أو قبلها على ما تقدم فعند القيام إلى الصلاة. That's what some of the ulama said, and that's what he's expressing here, that if you don't do it at the time of madmada or before, according to that other position, then he says when standing for the salat, as some of the ulama also said. No, it's not wasiyatul. That comes later. This Badruddin al-Aini, that's like 500 years before. So he says حتى قال بعضهم يستحب في 5 مواضع. So some of them said it's recommended at 5 times. He says عند اصفرار السن. So he says when the teeth become yellowed وتغير رائحة الفم, when the odor of the mouth changes, وعند القيام من النوم, when standing when arising from sleep, والقيام إلى الصلاة, and when initiating about to initiate the salat, وعند الوضوء, and during the wudu. انتهى. فدلت هذه العبارة على ما ذكرنا حيث قال عند القيام إلى الصلاة وعند الوضوء. So he says, so this ibara indicates now that it's recommended to do so at when one is going to pray as well. But of course, practically, I mean, remember if somebody is heading to the salat, then the idea is that the muqaddimat are from the salat. So you would simply brush your teeth at home, right, before heading out to the salat. Right? It doesn't mean like the second before you initiate the salat, because remember, you have to understand it in accordance with the madhab. Right? Just that, like we talked about with respect to the niyyah. Well, actually, we didn't necessarily talk about it because we just started today. But I mean that as all of you would know from your previous studies, that the idea of somebody who has an intention and they don't necessarily renew that intention at the time of the prayer, it's still considered to be valid, given the fact that it's connected. The whole thing is connected as long as he didn't do anything which would subsequently invalidate his intention. So the same applies to something like this. He says ويطلب السواك في غير هذه الأوقات كما ذكرنا آنفا في المقدمة. He says also sought at other times as was discussed in the مقدمة. ويدل عليه ما روي بالصحيحين. So he says what indicates that is what's mentioned in the صحيحين أنه صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم كان إذا قام من الليل يشوص فاه بالسواك. So he's kind of mentioning now hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, which affirm the idea that he just mentioned, that it's recommended at certain times. So when he arose, sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, from the night, then he would rub his teeth with the siwak. It says وعن أبي داود. Remember siwak here because it has a dual meaning. وعن أبي داود كان عليه الصلاة والسلام لا يستيقظ من ليل أو نهار إلا تسوك قبل أن يتوضأ. So again, that he wouldn't arise صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم except that he would brush his teeth before performing the wudu. وفي مسلم كان عليه الصلاة والسلام إذا دخل بيته بدأ بالسواك. If he would enter his house, the first thing he would do is brush his teeth. وفي الطبراني ما كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يخرج من بيته لشيء من الصلوات حتى يستاك. Again, indicating the idea or that we actually just talked about, which is that he wouldn't leave his house sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam until he had brushed his teeth. So that's also what we were saying before, is that brush your teeth and then you leave. وروى البخاري ومسلم وأبو داود والنسائي من حديث حذيفة بن اليمان قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا قام يتهجد يشوص فاه بالسواك. So if he so once he stood for when he would stand for tahajjud or arise for it, he would brush his teeth. Right? So إذا واستياكه صلى الله عليه وسلم بسواك عبد الرحمن ابن أبي بكر رضي الله تعالى عنهما عند وفاته يؤيد ذلك كله. Yeah, and also the usage of the siwak of Abd al-Rahman ibn Abi Bakr رضي الله تعالى عنهما, he says at the time of his passing, he says aids all of this, and all of this that he's mentioned, affirming that it's the general nature of it, and that it applies in different settings and occasions as well. So he says الباب الثاني في كيفيته. Right, so second section now, in the method of using it. وكيفية السواك على ما ورد أن يجعل خنصر يمينه أسفله والبنصر والوسطى والسبابة فوقه والإبهام أسفل رأسه كما روي عن ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه. So he says put the khinsar يمينه أسفله. So the khinsar is the small finger. He says put that at the bottom. He says والبنصر والوسطى والسبابة فوقه والإبهام أسفل رأسه. Right? So he's holding it like this. Sorry, this pen is slippery. I try to do it like this. Yeah, like this. Right. The thing is, the pen's not large enough. But anyway, it's something like that. Right. If I had something larger, I could. I feel like I got to do it. There we are. Right. So like this. That's what he's describing. Okay. Of course, he deliberately mentions now the right hand. So he says ولا ينظر إلى مناقشة العلامة نوح بقوله ينبغي أن يكون باليسار لا باليمين. Right, so Nuh Effendi has a bahth here where he talks about the idea that you should use your right hand or the left hand in order to brush your teeth. So he's saying that don't pay attention to the discussion now of Nuh Effendi when he said that it's more appropriate that it be with the left hand, not with the right. لأنه من باب إزالة الأقدار. Because why? Remember, why is he arriving at this conclusion? Because he's using the asl. What's the asl? He's saying, what's the purpose of brushing? He says to remove the filth of the mouth, right? So he's saying if that's the purpose, then he says, well, the basis and the asl for removing filth is to use your left hand, not your right hand. So he's saying you should brush with your left hand. So Maydani here is saying, don't pay attention to Nuh Effendi and his bahth. Why? He says, وَحَيْثُ ثَبَتَ عَنْ ابْنِ مَسْعُودٍ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَنْهُ فَلَا كَلَامٍ. So he says that established from Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud to do it in this specific method, as he just mentioned. Right? كذا روي عن ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه. Even though Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda says that he didn't find any clear kind of reference with such wording. But it's something, I mean, he's only mentioning it because it's something which is transmitted then. But that also kind of tells us something, that the fuqaha have something there. There's something transmitted. They just say, okay, let's use the right hand because this thing's transmitted, even though we don't appear to kind of, which makes it reasonable for Nuh Effendi now to come and say, well, actually, we should consider the asl in order to figure out which hand should be used. And it's also what the addendum now to this risala is Sheikh Abdul Fattah adding a whole section on using the right hand for it, not the left hand. Right, so that's basically what he does at the end of this risala. We won't be reading that, so you can read that in your own time if you're interested. He says, وَيَبُلُّ السِّوَاكَ قَبْلَ الْإِسْتِيَاكِ. So of course he's using it here in the context of a toothbrush now. So he says you should wet it before brushing your teeth. وَيَغْسِلُهُ بَعْدَهُ. And you should also, also wash it thereafter. He says, وَيَسْتَاكُ عَرْضًا لَا طُولًا. So he said you should do so horizontally, not this way, but this way. Right? He says نص عليه في المحيط وأخرج أبو نعيم من حديث عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها قالت كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يستاك عرضا لا طولا. So this is also transmitted. He says وفي مراسيل أبي داود إذا استكتم فاستاكوا عرضا إذا استكتم فاستاكوا عرضا. So if you do so horizontally. وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام استاكوا عرضا وادهنوا غبا واكتحلوا وترا. So he says brush your teeth this way horizontally, and he says وادهنوا, and then apply oil periodically and apply kuhul in an odd number. So an odd number of times. He says وأخرج الطبراني بإسناده إلى بهز قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يستاك عرضا ويشرب مصا ويقول هو أهنأ. I guess, I mean, that's not directly related. That, I mean, that's related to the idea. The mawdi' shahid here is the idea of the horizontal brushing. As for the second part, this is وَيَشْرَبُ مَصًّا. What does that mean? It means a gentle drinking, which is kind of not drinking in gulps. Right? Gulp, 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 gulp. Rather, you take, I don't know if you want to call it a sip, but you take you take it slowly, basically. So he says, so this is lighter on the stomach. It's better for digestion and so on and so forth. He says, وَيُمِرُّ السِّوَاكَ عَلَى لِسَانِهِ. He says you should also pass the toothbrush over your tongue. قال في المغني ويستاك على أسنانه ولسانه. So you should do so on your teeth and also your tongue. So now, of course, remember I said that you have to take everything out of your head. So now if you consider oral hygiene and also what the dentists say, you might have heard the idea of brushing your tongue and brushing your teeth. Right? So there's this is how you need to think about this masala and think about what Alama Nuh Effendi was saying and all of these types of things, because they give us a sense of the asl when it comes to the idea of the siwak. It's not coming in a vacuum. There's a ma'na to it. What's the ma'na? The ma'na, as you're seeing now, as you'll continue to see, is really oral hygiene. This is the ma'na of it. This is the ma'na of the siwak. Right? Brushing your teeth is really about oral hygiene. This is why the thing that you use is actually of no consequence. That's what we saw right at the beginning. What you use to achieve oral hygiene is actually of no consequence. Right? So you can use anything. There's nothing specifically which is considered to be a sunnah. And all of the fawa'i'id that he's mentioning, they just pertain to whatever toothbrush you use to attain this reality. And he already defined what that means, right? I mean, we'll see it actually in more details coming as well. So he talks about it here actually. Oh, sorry, I think I skipped ahead. He says, انتهى وقال أبو موسى رضي الله تعالى عنه أتينا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فرأيته يستاك على لسانه متفق عليه. that he was brushing his tongue. وينبغي أن يكون السواك طول شبر. He says, so it's proper now for the toothbrush to be the length of a handspan. Right, handspan. He says, فلو طال عن الشبر فمركب للشيطان. So he says, so if it's larger than that, then it's, again, it's a riding mount for the shaitan. Now, Sheikh Abdul Fattah, he has a lot to say about this. I think it will come up shortly. Again, I'm not going to go through the ta'liq and everything, but some of these types of things are kind of transmitted, so the ulama just kind of mentioned them. But it's not meant so much as a literal type of thing. That's not how to understand the other. I mean, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that we'll see, really. But the point is something about, like, this is just a phrase which is used to really express waste. I mean, that's really what they're trying to say. It's like israf. So that's why shaitan is sitting there. Why? Because it's just a waste of, a brush. So, like, somebody else could have had that, type of thing. He says, خاليا من العقد والإعوجاج. He says, not have any, not so that it should be generally straight. Again, is your toothbrush wonky or is it straight? Right? So the idea is that there's no benefit in it being like this way and that way, or it having like a rough part or anything. That's not the maqsid. These types of things, again, are trying to just, they might seem like common sense, but it's really, this is the purpose of the instruction, is really just common sense. Right? He says, وَلَا يَقْبِضُ السِّوَاكَ قَبْضًا. Don't just grab it like qabdan, like this. Why? You brush your teeth like this, you damage your gums. Again, it'll just cause you to bleed. It'll harm you. He says, فَإِنَّهُ يُورِثُ الْبَاسُورِ. So what's basur? Basur is the one thing that I always forget the word of. I know what it is in my mind, but I always forget the English word for it. Does anybody know? It's important. No, it's not. Like subhanAllah, every time I see the word, even though it's so common in the books of fuqaha, I know what it is in my mind. I can describe it to you, but it's just easier just to say what it is. Yeah, it's hemorrhoids. Right. So so this is basur. Write it in so I don't forget in future. So what does it mean now? It says if you hold the siwak like this, you'll get hemorrhoids. Right? Is that not an odd thing to say? Why are all the ulama transmitting this? Right? It's a very odd thing to say, but they don't. It's not meant, again, literally. They mean it to express harm. What's the harm? The harm that we just talked about. That's going to cause harm to your gums and everything. And of course, we could kind of expand it a bit more than that as well. But this is enough, inshallah, for the time being. Of course, there's different ways that these rasail, I think I've mentioned this before as well, perhaps in previous episodes, that we could read some of these with a lot more detail and over a longer period of time. But I'm trying to do my best to keep them relatively short so we can get through them. Each time we sit, we can kind of get through an entire risala. It says, وَلَا يَمَصُّهُ فَإِنَّهُ يُورِثُ الْعَمَى. He says you also shouldn't suck it because this will bring about blindness, right? So if you suck your toothbrush, you're going to become blind, right? But again, it's not meant in that literal kind of way. He says, وَلَا يَسْتَك. Of course, it also depends now on the nature of some of these types of things. If you're not using, so for example, if it is a regular toothbrush and you suck it, maybe all of the, like we could understand in our times now, like all the microplastics are kind of going inside, right? And then that's going to cause you harm, right? So he's saying, no, just use it for its purpose and then just don't touch it after that. He said, وَلَا يَسْتَاكُ وَهُوَ مُضْطَجِعٌ. Yeah, again, another odd one, but it's don't brush your teeth now whilst laying down, right? So he says, فَإِنَّهُ يُورِثْ كِبَرَ الطِّحَالِ. Yeah. And in so like inflammation of the some type of inflammation of the spleen or the gut, as you're saying. Um, so again, it's some of these things seem a bit odd, but they're just trying to express a manner. If you take it literally, then it becomes like something that okay, that's not true. Just cross it off, which is actually what Sheikh Abdul Fattah, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, really will express here. We'll see it in a second. I'll just show you the first line. He says, وَلَا يَضَعُ السِّوَاكَ بَلْ يَنْصِبُهُ لِأَنَّهُ خَطَرُ الْجُنُونِ. So what does he say now? He says that you shouldn't put your toothbrush down sideways to make sure it's standing up. Right? Make sure it's standing up. He says, why? Because otherwise you're at a risk of insanity. Risk of insanity. Right now, again, some of these things they are transmitted. I said inflammation of the spleen or inflammation of the gut. So he says قلت هذا الذي ذكروه هنا ليس له here in the footnote ليس له دليل شرعي ولا مستند نقلي أو عقلي. Right. So he says that there's no proof for these types of things. Of course, there is a proof in the sense that something has been transmitted, but it's not necessarily soundly transmitted. So it's not a proof shar'an from that perspective. But some of these types of things, they're just part of the general adab. I mean, there's again, we'd have to have a different setting and a different context in a majlis where we can talk about the adab literature and the like, and how the ulama and ahlul tasawwuf, ahlul salah would deal with those types of matters which have been transmitted. So anyway, there's perhaps you can read this over here, but there's probably a couple of other things that we could say about this, but inshallah, we'll leave that for another time. He says, وَإِذَا فَقَدَ السِّوَاكَ فَبِخِرْقَةٍ خَشِنَةٍ. He says, so if you're missing now the siwak, then he says with a rough cloth. Why a rough cloth? Again, because the point is to get the yellowness off your teeth. To get all of that stuff off your teeth, and that's how you're going to do it now. It doesn't work with like I mean, it might work with like a smoother cloth as well, but the maqsad is fully fulfilled with something like this. وتنوب الأصبع عن السواك أيضا. Also, you can use your finger when you don't have anything else. لما روى البيهقي عن رجل من الأنصار قال يا رسول الله صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم رغبتنا في السواك فهل دون ذلك من شيء؟ قال أصبعك سواك عند وضوئك تمر بها على أسنانك. So you've encouraged us to use the siwak and brush our teeth, or to brush our teeth. So he says that is there anything less than that? He says your finger is a toothbrush for your wudu, and he says you'd pass it over your teeth. So if you don't have a siwak, is there anything you can do? So this is what he says. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. He said, وفي رواية عن أنس رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الأصبع تجزئ عن السواك. Same thing, that the finger suffices for brushing. وروى البيهقي في سننه من حديث أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه أن النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم قال يجزئ عن السواك الأصابع. أي the fingers suffice, the fingers suffice for it. What about damage from abrasion? If the cloth is too rough, can't it remove some of the enamel and cause sensitivity? I mean, of course, if it's intense, I guess, but this is not the normal thing to do. Rather, he's just talking about if you don't have this, you don't have an actual toothbrush, then what do? Use something like this, it will fulfill the sunnah. That's the point. So it's something maybe like almost like a towel texture. Right, so it's not like extremely. We're not talking about something that's going to rip the, enamel off your teeth. I mean, we're just talking about something that's gonna wipe it clean. Antihal is spleen, so means enlarged spleen. Yeah, not sandpaper exactly. He says وروى البيهقي في سننه من حديث أنس رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال يجزئ عن السواك الأصابع انتهى. So we said that. ولا تكفي الأصبع إلا عند فقد السواك لا عند وجوده كما في الكافي. Yeah, so importantly, he says that this only functions, finger will only work if you don't actually have a toothbrush. Right, so كما في الكافي. أي of حفظ الدين النسفي وكيفيته كما في ابن أبي الحاج. So in the شرح of the حلبة المجلي, so he describes the method of brushing now. He says وأن يبدأ بالإبهام من الجانب الأيمن. So you'd start with the, well, if you're using your fingers now, with the thumb on the right side, ويستاك فوقا وتحتا, up and down. ثم بالسبابة من الأيسر كذلك, up and down. Right, so that's how you do it with the two fingers. ويقوم العلك مقامه للنساء لرقة البشرة لكن مع النية. So it's another important point now, which is that the siwak is considered to be a sunnah for men, not for women. So this is why he says over here that the ilk, a gum now, it serves the same purpose, i.e. it, and then you can see some of the benefits of these types of things in ancient times about the fact that it serves the purpose of oral hygiene and it keeps the saliva and everything in the teeth clean, just like brushing wood. So he says, so this is superior. Why لرقة البشرة? Why? Because using a toothbrush can be harmful to their gums, to a lady's gums, versus a man's manly kind of gums and a lady's ladylike gums. Right? So they said, but look, just breaking this, at least in ancient times, breaking this branch off this tree, shoving it in your mouth and like cutting yourself in every direction is also not a ladylike thing to do, because this is also a consideration. So this is why he says that you would chew gum with an intention of siwak, i.e. brushing your teeth, and you have the same thawab. Right? Now, of course, it doesn't necessarily make sense to say something like that if everybody is now encouraged, if we have a specific thing called a toothbrush and everybody is encouraged to use it, and everybody effectively is using it all the time, then it doesn't make sense to say don't use it for the wudu, and then you, before you go to sleep or when you wake up in the morning, you're like brushing your teeth. Right? That doesn't make sense. And of course, even though the dentist and it's from normal oral hygiene and the like, the idea is that you should intend a sunnah when you wake up in the morning, when you go to sleep at night and the like, and you have the thawab of a sunnah when you do these types of things. Of course, it's a general recommendation. That's what I mean by sunnah here. It's not sunnah mu'akkada, but it's from the adab of the sharia, as we saw in those hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. So he mentions now a fa'idah. He says, ويكره العلك للرجل للتشبه بالنساء ما لم يكن للتداوي. So now chewing gum is makruh for men. Why? Because chewing gum is feminine. Just like brushing your teeth is a masculine thing to do. Ladies don't do it. Similarly, chewing gum, because that's a replacement now for brushing your teeth, is a feminine thing to do, so men don't do it. Right, so these types of things are important because there's only a limited number of things which are considered to be unisex, so to speak. Otherwise, you can see even to the point of things that you put into your mouth, there's a distinction between men and women. So, and the Sharia is very strict about these types of things, i.e. that there should be no tashabbuh whatsoever, that men should behave like men, ladies should behave like ladies, and there should be no circumstance when a man is behaving like a lady, right? So in his whether in his outward appearance or in his actions, which is the idea of chewing gum in this case here. So he says, unless you have a legitimate excuse, like in the case where there's some medical need, right? This is tadawi. He says, قال الطحطاوي ويستحب أن يدلك الأسنان ظاهرها وباطنها وأطرافها والحنك وهو باطن الفم وأعلى الفم من داخل. He says والأسفل من طريق من طرف مقدم اللحيين. Yeah, so he just mentions now. So he just mentions that it's recommended now to brush your teeth. He says the outside, the inside. Again, what are you doing with your toothbrush? Think about it, right? You're doing that. You're doing the outside if you're brushing properly. You're doing the inside. You're doing the sides and everything. He says, "Wal hanak wa batinul fam." The bottom is a'la al fam min dakhil, the palate, right? So doing that again. Your dentist tells you all of these things, right? He says, "Wal asfal min tarafi muqaddam al lahyayn," and this side and that side, getting right in the back of the molars and everything. This is normal oral hygiene. This is the asl. This is what we're talking about. This is the maqsid of, and this is the asl behind siwak. Brushing your teeth, this is the purpose. So it's why you say the fuqaha are saying these things, which the same thing that your dentist says. There's nothing special that the fuqaha are saying over here. Of course, the special thing is that it's been specifically transmitted to us as something of great merit, right? And that somebody does it, and then there's a significant fadl, which is what we'll see now in this final section. But the idea is that nothing here should be surprising. That it's like if you're only brushing like this side and that's it, and it's a 5-second job, then again, this is only paying lip service, as it were, to the sunnah. This is not you're not doing the ma'na of what like the fuqaha are expecting of you. So if it's just like a kind of you just rub it in your mouth for like 5 seconds, then you put it back, it's just like which is what we talked about earlier, as it being a symbolic act, then you've missed out on what you're supposed to be doing. It says ويدعو المتسوق بقوله اللهم طهر نكهتي. Right, so he says that the person now who is brushing their teeth, they should make a dua, a supplication that, oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what did he say? Purify my smell, my aroma. Make sure I don't have bad breath. Oh Allah, keep my breath smelling fresh. That's what the dua is. وَمَحِصْ ذُنُوبِي. Right, and then of course it becomes like a bit religious. It's like, and then wipe away my sins. Right, wipe away. It's like somebody who said, it's like somebody who's trying to make dua to lose weight. So here, Allahumma khaffif wazni wa thaqil mizani. Right? It says, make my weight lighter and make my scale pans on the final day heavy. Right? So take all that weight and put it on my scale pans. So he said, وَيَغْسِلُ فَاهُ بَعْدَهُ بِمَاءٍ بَارِدٍ فِي الصَّيْفِ وَحَارٍ فِي الشِّتَاءِ. He said, and then you should rinse out your mouth with cold water in the summer times and hot water, warm water, in the winter times. Right? Again, these are all, I mean, there's many things like this which are just from ancient wisdom and ancient medicine. It's not like any type of shell. Would a gum still be symbolic since everyone uses toothbrushes these days? Yeah, I would imagine so. So it would be pretty symbolic, and it's not necessarily a feminine thing anymore because this changes in accordance with a'raf and the like. So yeah, that's why it wouldn't make sense for somebody who's brushing. Again, like I said, if you stop brushing altogether and start using it, then maybe, but of course, if it's this is kind of what's normal, and people do this, which is obviously the case now, then it doesn't make sense to kind of transition away from it. Rather, somebody just intends this fulfilling the sunnah thereby, and this is it suffices. وفي الدراية again الشرح عند الهداية يقول عند الاستياك اللهم طهر فمي ونور قلبي وطهر بدني وحرم جسدي على النار وأدخلني برحمتك في عبادك الصالحين. Again, just another supplication. الباب الثالث في منافعه. So the final bab now before the khatima, he says on its benefits and its wisdoms. He says ومنافعه كثيرة جدا وقد أوصلها بعضهم إلى 60 منفعة وقيل فوق 90. So he says it has many benefits, and he says some of the ulama have said that it has 60, others said it's more than 90. So you can see that Sheikh Abdul Fattah rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, he says here ذكر المؤلف رحمه الله تعالى هنا جملة كبيرة من منافع السواك وهذه المنافع بعضها ورد في السنة المطهرة فهو محبوب مشروع وبعضها ثبت في الطب فهو مقبول متبوع. So he says that some of these are established in hadith. We all accept على الرأس والعين. We accept all of these. He says some are just medical benefits. It's just طب. It's nothing special. You go to your dentist, they'll tell you the same thing. It's not like he's become a faqih or something. It's just that he's a dentist and this is oral hygiene. So the benefit that they're mentioning, that it's going to purify, it's going to give you good breath. Yeah, every toothbrush gives you good breath. Like there's nothing special, right? There's nothing special about it from that perspective. If you use any good toothbrush, and that's what it does. And then he says فهو مقبول متبوع وما لم يكن كذلك فهو في نظر الفقهاء من باب الترغيب أو الترهيب. Right? I say if otherwise everything else is just targhib. Right? If it's not in hadith and it's not a medical benefit, then it's just the fuqaha just trying to encourage you to brush your teeth. That's it. So that's how you should understand the things that he mentions over here. And of course, these are the types of things which people transmit and they say. And anyway, you'll see as we get into them. So he says, منها أنه مرضات للرحمن مطهرة للفم. Right, that's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the All Merciful, and it's purifying for the mouth. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم السواك مطهرة للفم مرضاة للرب. وروي عن علي الرضا وابن عباس وعطاء رضي الله تعالى عنهم عليكم بالسواك. Yeah, so they transmitted that use the siwak فلا تغفلوا عنه, and don't forget it. وأديموه فإن فيه رضاء الرحمن, because the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is within it. وتضاعف صلاته إلى 99 ضعفا أو إلى 400 ضعف. Right, so 99 times greater, your prayer is 99 times greater, 400 or up to 400 times. He says وقد ورد أيضا صلاة به تعدل 70 صلاة بدونه. So if you brush your teeth, again, in the wudu, as he was talking about, then your prayer is 70 times greater than a prayer which is prayed without it. ومنها أن إدامته تورث سعة والغنى وتيسير الرزق. So if you do it, then it brings about expansiveness, it brings about wealth and prosperity. وتيسير الرزق, and it brings about rizq in your life. Again, these types of things, it's not a trick that you use a toothbrush and then you're going to become rich. The idea is that you follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in your life, and that becomes a means of ghina of the qalb and the like, that you have richness of heart, freedom from need, and so on. You have expansiveness and taysir in your life. That's what it means. It's not like I'm going to use like this special thing that I bought from $1. I'm going to rip it out, some stick from the East, as it were. Of course, if you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. Like that's just, it's a toothstick. I mean, this is its purpose. But the idea is that that's not specifically maqsood. That's what we've been talking about. But the point is that it's not like a theoretic, it's not like a magic trick. It's not a symbolic thing, put it in my mouth and going to brush it, and then, oh, mashallah, I'm going to have like a taysir rizq now. He says, ومنها أنه يشد اللثة ويسكن الصداع وعروق الرأس ويذهب وجع الرأس حتى قيل إنه لا يضرب عرق ساكن ولا يسكن جاذب يعني بعد المداومة عليه. Again, these are just medical kind of things. So I'm just going to go through a bit more quickly. But he just says, again, sorts out keeps the gums, good and clean, and it prevents, puts headaches to rest, because I guess it hits in different places and stuff. I guess some ancient medicines will tell you some of these types of things, does away with headaches and so on. He says, ومنها أنه يذهب البلغم, does away with phlegm. ويقوي الأسنان. So some of these types of things are also a consequence, actually, some of the medical things now, are actually a consequence of the stick, right? So the stick itself, it has certain medicinal, because there's, certain minerals or whatever is kind of coming out of it, is leaking out of it. Some of these are beneficial. And these are some of the medical things that he's referring to. They won't necessarily come out of your plastic toothbrush now. So these things but these aren't maqsood lidatihi. So if you use it for that purpose, then it's not a ziyadat fa'ida from a sunnah perspective. That you can say as a fa'ida is like, oh, I'm benefiting from the nutrients of the stick, right? As it were, like nutrients of the natural world, which was the question from earlier that somebody had asked. So, but the point is that it's not a ziyada fi sunniyah. They're not doing something religiously better. I might be getting like this medical fa'idah from it, and that's fine, right? So this is what he's expressing over here. Strengthens the teeth, ويجل البصر, strengthens the eyesight, ويقوي البدن, strengthens the body. Again, you have to kind of do some work sometimes with some of this type of stuff. ويصحح المعدة, straightens out the stomach. ويزيد الرجل فصاحة وعقلا وحفظا, increases a person in in terms of their eloquence and in terms of their intellect, in terms of memorization. ويطهر القلب, and it purifies the heart. ويزيد في الحسنات ويفرج الملائكة ويفرح الملائكة, so it pleases the angels. وتصافحه لنور وجهه, and they shake hands with him. He says because the light on his face, i.e., because of following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is to brush your teeth, not because of some symbolic gesture. Again, like this is important to kind of keep in mind, because this is what he has been trying to express to us. Right? وتشيعه إذا خرج إلى الصلاة, and send him off when he goes to the prayer. وتستغفر حملات العرش لفاعله عند خروجه من المسجد, and the carriers and the bearers of the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they seek forgiveness for the person who does this when he exits his home to go to the mosque. وفي ليلة الاثنين والجمعة عند عرض الأعمال وكذلك الأنبياء والرسل. وهو مسخطة ومطردة للشيطان وهو مصف للذهن واللون مهضم للطعام مكثر للولد. So he says it's something which makes the devil upset and makes him angry, and something that pushes him away, sends him far away. He says it clears the mind and perhaps the saliva or something, or maybe the color of a person's face or something. Anyway, it says, and it helps you digest your food. It's good to, again, that would be part of the nutrients of it. And mukthirun walad gives you more children. Again, you have to kind of jump through some hoops for a lot of these types of things to make sense of them. Otherwise, anybody who thinks literally these are majazi statements, right? They're not meant in a literal kind of way. So anybody who understands them literally is not really understanding what the ulama are actually trying to say. So sometimes, as we saw earlier, it's just from the perspective that what it will lead to if somebody does something like this. Why? Because if you follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ with respect to this type of issue, you'll also follow the other sunnahs of the Prophet ﷺ. One of them is تكاثروا, right? تزوجوا and تكاثروا فإني أباهي بكم الأمم يوم القيامة. Right. So at the end of the day, there's an encouragement to have children. So the idea is that this is from the sunnah, and if you do sunnah, you'll do more sunnah. Right? It's a barakah of like other sunnah. And then whoever does it داوم عليه يجوز على الصراط كالبرق الخاطف, that he'll be like a swift flash of lightning across the sirat. It's also a means وهو سبب لإعطاء الكتاب اليمين, a means of receiving the book with the right hand. Again, how so? Because you follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in your life, so you can be hopeful of a good ending and a good akhirah. He says مبطئ للشيب, it slows down aging. ومقوٍ على طاعة الله تعالى, and then it's something strengthens you to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ومذهب للحرارة من الجسد, and does away with the heat of the body. ويذهب الوجع, does away with pains, as we saw earlier. ويقوي الظهر, strengthens the back. ومن داوم عليه لا ينحني ظهره, that his لا ينحني ظهره, that he won't become a hunchback, right? He says, وَمِنْ أَعْظَمِ مَنَافِعِهِ أَنَّهُ يُذَكِّرُ الشَّهَادَةَ عِنْدَ خُرُوجِ الرُّوحِ, that it reminds a person of the testification of faith at the time that their ruh will leave their body. Again, why? Because you applied sunnah in your life. That all returns to the same type of manner. ويسرع النزع, and then your ruh leaves quickly and swiftly and easily. ويبيض الإسنان, whitens the teeth. ويطيب النكهة, and it gives you a pleasant smell, aroma, odor of the mouth. ويصفي الحلق, and it cleans out the throat. ويذكي الفطنة, and then it gives you good insight. ويقطع الرطوبة, and it stops all of the moistures and the like, again coming from ancient wisdoms and ancient medicine. ويحد البصر, and strengthens your eyesight. أي يزيد في حدته فهو غير الجلاء. So it's something which is not it's not like the kuhul. He says, وَيُضَاعِفُ الْأَجْرِ لِفَاعِلِهِ, because you see some of those things with kuhul as well. Again, these are medical benefits. They're not like religious benefits. He says, وَيُضَاعِفُ الْأَجْرِ لِفَاعِلِهِ, and it increases the thawab for the person who does it. وَيُنَمِّ الْمَالِ, it increases one's wealth, as we saw earlier with the ghina. وَيُعِينُ عَلَى قَضَاءِ الْحَوَائِجِ, and it aids one in fulfilling one's needs. وَيُوَسَّعَ عَلَى مُدِيمِهِ في قبره, and his grave will be expanded. وهو مؤنس في اللحد, and it will be there to in his grave, because the amal have forms in the akhirah. ويكتب له أجر من لم يستك في يومه وهو سبب لفتح أبواب الجنة وغلق أبواب النيران على فاعله وتثني الملائكة على فاعله بقولها مقتد بالأنبياء ويقفو آثارهم ويلتمس هديهم هذا في كل يوم. So he says, ويلمس هديهم. And that's what Sheikh Abdul Fattah says over here. Anyway, just mentioning more things, that it opens doors of paradise and it closes the doors of the hellfire, and the malaika, again, just emphasizing the same things that he's mentioned before, that the malaika will praise him and so on, and he's following the footsteps of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. ولا يخرج من الدنيا إلا وهو طاهر مطهر وحتى يسقى شربة من حوض النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو الرحيق المختوم ويأتيه الملك عند النزع في الصورة التي يأتي فيها الأولياء والأنبياء. Yeah, so again, the angel of death will come to him in a pleasant form. He'll be drinking from, the hawd of the Prophet ﷺ, and so on and so forth. Again, he will leave this world purified state, in a state of purity. وهو مذهب للحفر والنخر. Here, last few things now, and it does away with what I guess the tartar and the tooth decay. ومذهب لوجع الضرس والأسنان, does away with pains. Why? Because you don't brush your teeth, then you get like cavities and stuff. Right? So you brush your teeth, and it does away with all of these types of things. وترحب به الأرض وتقول كنت أحب نعمتك التي يحبها الله فاليوم أوسع لك بطني, أو كنت. Oh, sorry. Sorry. It says كنت نعمتك التي يحبها الله فاليوم أوسع لك بطني ويوسع له في القبر مد البصر وأزيد ويكرم ويكنى مع الأنبياء ويدخل معهم الجنة ضاحكا بلا حساب وينبت الشعر. If you look at the manafi', it's really, some of them are really pretty incredible. Right? It's really pretty incredible. And so he says that the grave will welcome him as well. So he says, that the grave will kind of expand itself, as he's mentioned before as well, and then he will see as far as the eye can see, and further than that, and he'll be honored with the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam, enter paradise laughing without any accounting, and it's a means of hair growth. وينبت الشعر. وإذا قرأ المتسوق, he says فما من حرف يخرج من فمه إلا ويدخل في جوف ملك لأن الملك دائما فمه على فم المتسوق كما هو مذكور في الحديث. Yeah, finally, that once he recites, then he says there's not a single letter which he recites which exits from his mouth except that it enters into the the body of an angel. He says because an angel is always on his its mouth is always on the mouth of the mutasawwik, i.e. the person who brushes their teeth. He says, as is mentioned in the hadith, and you can find here the hadith which is mentioned, where حتى يضع فاه على فيه فما يخرج من فيه شيء إلا صار في جوف الملك. Right? فطهروا أفواهكم للقرآن. And so this is the hadith, and you can look it up if you want any further information on that. So alhamdulillah, this brings us to the Khatima and his final comments on this issue. And it's relatively short, so it's on the final stretch. If you're still with us, then may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you for your patience. He says, Khatima, أفضل سواك الأراك. So the final thing he mentions is that the best toothbrush now, he says, is the arak toothbrush. And really, if you consider this, it's he's talking about the kind of natural toothbrushes which are there, right? The ones which are available. So off the bitter wood, which is what he's going to mention in just a moment, because all of these are legitimate and they bring about some of the medical fawaid which he's been talking about. He's saying the best form is actually the one from the arak tree. So this is why he says afdal siwak al arak. But it's not specifically a religious point as such. Right? It's just something off the ones which are there. This is the superior one if you're using those natural kind of ones. He says ثم الزيتون. Why? Because this is the ones that we have. Right? The point is that this is the ones that we have. It's not that there's like something else on the table, so to speak. It's like there's only different trees, right? And you just break off the branch and you just make a toothstick with it, right? So you have this tree, this tree, this tree, right? So you're saying the arak tree, this is the best one, right? So, but it doesn't preclude the idea that there could be something else which is now made specifically for this purpose. You don't have to go to a tree now, right? So, of course, then it just returns to what we said, what we were talking about earlier, which is the idea now that the fa'ida is not a religious fa'ida that you get for using like the wooden that would just be like a medical thing. The fact that it has certain nutrients and vitamins, whatever you get from this particular thing. But of course, it has no manner if it doesn't actually serve its purpose properly. If it doesn't actually brush, if you're only tickling your teeth with it, right? If you're just like you're just putting it in your mouth as a symbolic gesture at the time of wudu, for example. Then when you go to sleep at night, you start brushing your teeth, right? So it's kind of like an odd reality because now you've made it as if it's a religious thing. If it's a religious thing, you're using it all the time. You don't use a toothbrush, but if you still use a use it in conjunction with a toothbrush, whatever, okay, fine, right? But it will be a funny logic if every time you do wudu, use this. Why? Because in your mind, this is superior. And what we've been reading so far is that actually that's not the case. Right? Because the superiority is just in the sense of nutrients and stuff, is medical superiority, which means that this should be the normal thing that you use, like all the time. Not just like, okay, I'm really trying to brush, because I can't really do it with the stick. So now I use my electronic, toothbrush or whatever. Like I paid like $100 for it. And now I'm brushing my teeth. It's like really good. And like, but what was the siwak for then? And that's what I'm saying. That's why it almost serves for some people just mere symbolism that I use this as a symbolic thing to say I fulfilled the sunnah. This is not the sunnah. Sunnah is to actually clean your teeth. Um, should we hold a toothbrush the sunnah way? That's not sunnah way as well. Of course, it's a way to not harm yourself. That's the purpose, right? So it's there just to kind of give you something to show that okay, this is how you wouldn't harm yourself. So okay, if there's if you can use it in a different way, like your toothbrush, and you don't harm yourself, it's the same maqsad. So it's not maqsood li dhatihi. So he says, then zaytun, olive, لأن زيتون سواك الأنبياء عليهم الصلاة والسلام كما في الينابيع. So he says this is the siwak of the Anbiya of the Prophets عليهم الصلاة والسلام. Oops. ثم الخوف خوخ أو التوت, and then different types, berry tree and plum tree and berry tree and different types of trees, right? Because remember, we said that these are the options. It's just different trees. So of these trees, which is the best tree? That's what they're talking about. So he's saying أو أصل الشوك كما في الصلاة المسعودية. It's not quite clear to me what أصل الشوك would be, but صلاة المسعودية I think is maybe a Farsi book. وإلا فمن مطلق شجر مر. He says, look, otherwise any bitter tree. Because why bitter tree? Because that has the nutrients. There's no fadl for it. There's no fadl in it. It's just it has the nutrients. That's the point. That's exactly the reason why the ta'lil here is what? لأنه أقطع للبلغم, because it prevents phlegm. Again, that's a medical thing, is it not? وأنقى للصدر, right? And it's cleaner for your chest and everything. وأهنأ للطعام, and it's better for your digestive system, right? That the bitter sticks are better because you're swallowing the juices of it, right? So those juices which are swallowed are better for you than other types of trees. So we can make our own toothsticks in nature as long as it has bristles. Leaves aren't poisonous. Yeah, I mean, as he says over here, ويكره بالقصب. So any type of weeds and the like. كما يكره التخليل به. You don't do takhleel, interlace with this type of thing. Why? Because harmful. وبالرمان, pomegranate, والريحان, yeah, I guess basil. Some of these types of things, again, if you don't, if you're not familiar, like you don't live outside with the plants and everything in nature, then you won't know, you'll be none the wiser about what to use and what not to use. I mean, even if I sent you outside, you never seen basil in your life, and I said don't use basil. Now, what difference has that made to you? Right. So these things it won't necessarily make sense unless you're like somebody who is lives in that world. Right. He says ويكره بكل مؤذن. So it's makruh with every mu'dhin. Why? Because it harms you. ويحرم بكل ذي سم. And anything which is poisonous, which is what what was said as well, that anything which is poisonous, that's haram because it will kill you or harm you. ويكره التسوق بطرفيه I use the top side, the bottom side. Now the bottom of the siwak, does anybody use it? The point is that if you make that usable as well, he says makruh. Use this side and that side is makruh. He said وبسواك الغير ما لم يغسله. And it's also the siwak of somebody else if he does not um, if he doesn't wash it. We'll come back to that because it's coming up. He said وقد سبق أنه تسوك صلى الله عليه وسلم بسواك عبد الرحمن بن أبي بكر رضي الله تعالى عنهما ويكره بسواك نفسه ما لم يغسله ولا يترك السواك بلا غسل. So he says also, we've seen earlier that the Prophet ﷺ used the siwak of another, so that establishes that it's fine. He's going to mention something about that shortly. But he says it's makruh to use one's own siwak if you don't wash it. Again, it would be like a medical kind of thing. He says, وَلَا يَتْرُكُ السِّوَاكَ بِلَا غَسْلٍ. Don't leave it without washing it. Why? Because again, there'll be germs, bacteria, that type of thing. وموضع سواكه عليه الصلاة والسلام من أذنه موضع القلم من أذن الكاتب. So where do you put the siwak? He says he said the place is the udhun, like the udhun like the qalam al-katib. So this was the place, right? This is the way you keep it, right? So on your ear. He said وأسوكة الصحابة خلف آذانهم. I'm sorry. Yeah, does anybody see a difference between these two? I mean, it seems the same to me. He says فأسفكة الصحابة خلف آذانهم. It's behind the ears. كما قاله الحكيم الترمذي وكان بعضهم يضعه في طي عمامته. In the rounds of the turban. Right. So again, none of these are maqsood لذاته. It's just about they didn't have pockets. There's no pocket. Right. So that's why even in the time of the Salaf Abu Hanifa and the like, why does Abu Hanifa say وَسِعُوا أَكْمَامَكُمْ? That widen your sleeves. Why? Because they put money in there, they put books in there, they put all kinds of things in there. Right. So but also that's a sign of Jalal in their times. But the point is that it wasn't necessarily like a normal pocket, how you conceive of pockets now. So where are you going to put this? Where are you going to put your toothbrush? Right. Exactly. So it's like on your ear or in your turban or somewhere. Like I'm not going to hold it the whole time. So that's the point. So you don't like, oh, I'm following like it's like you don't have to make it like a maqsood type of thing now, right? It's not maqsood lidati. He says ولا يكره السواك للصائم عندنا مطلقا ولو بعد الزوال. So it's not disliked now to brush one's teeth for somebody who's fasting. He says this is unconditioned. He says unconditionally. He says ولو بعد الزوال, even after dhuhr time, after zawal. خلاف للشافعي, contrary to Imam Shafi'i رضوان الله تعالى عليه, لنا قوله عليه الصلاة والسلام. So what supports what we have to say is خير خلال الصائم السواك, which is the hadith which we saw earlier as well, that the best of the traits of the faster is brushing teeth. ولم يقيد لا قبل الزوال ولا بعده. And it wasn't conditioned by before zawal or after zawal. Right, so this is what supports Hanafi precedent and the Hanafi position. He says فائدة. He says قال ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما من تسوك بسواك غيره فقد الحفظ. ذكره عنه الحكيم الترمذي في كتابه العلل. انتهى من تحذير الإخوان العلامة يوسف الحنفي. وقال أيضا في موضع آخر من ذلك الكتاب من استاك على رأس الخلاء فذهب بصره فلا يلومن إلا نفسه. انتهى. So it seems that he's found some fawaid here from some book. And it says that it's makruh, that whoever actually the first thing he says is that whoever uses it now, then he will lose his memory. right? So if you use the siwak of somebody else, i.e. somebody else's toothbrush, you lose your memory. Um, of course, the idea is that this is usurpation, that this is ghasb, this is without permission, you're using it. So what happens, using somebody's property, you're benefiting from them, and this is obviously almost like a sin, and then sins are going to harm you, and then sins can be a cause of memory loss. Again, you have to jump through a few hoops, but I'm trying to be swift here. So he says that Yusuf al-Hanafi actually mentions this in his book, and he says also another place that whoever uses it ala Rasa'i'l Khala, and then yeah, I guess at the door of the toilet, then he says that I'll do away with his basar. Like he loses sight if he does that. So if that happens and he loses sight, then he shouldn't blame anybody but himself, right? Which again is not to be taken literally, but it's just a discouragement. This is not the time. The time is عند الوضوء, not عند when somebody goes to the khala, to the toilet, or to relieve themselves and the like. Anyway, there is a risala for anybody who is interested by Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi. I think Sheikh Abdul Fattah actually mentions it somewhere. إفادة I forgot what it's called now. But anyway, if anybody knows it, they can just post it. Post it here, and then I'll say it. But I can't remember what it's called now. But anyway, he has a risala on using the siwak of somebody else. But also in the madhab, there's a nas you can find, for example. Yeah, sorry, it's ifadatul khair. Yeah, and Khairuddin Ramli, he actually has a fatwa on this specific issue, and he actually quotes al-Diya al-Ma'nawi of Ibn al-Diya, where he says that it's fine if you have the permission of the other individual. So that's in terms of a nas from the madhab, and he says, وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تمت على يد كاتبها محمد بن الشيخ أديب al-Ghani al-Maydani وبهذا القدر كفاية والله موافق وهو أعلم بالصواب. So alhamdulillah, الذي بنعمته تتم الصالحات. So we completed this reading, and I pray that this reading was beneficial. I apologize for the speed at times, but I'm trying to keep these sessions bearable and not unbearably lengthy. And inshallah, there's much to think about. There's much to kind of ponder in light of how people consider the idea of the siwak and the idea of what I'm calling the toothbrush, and what exactly it means in a life and in a world in which people are using toothbrushes, and then sometimes only symbolically kind of using this type of thing, especially when it's not done properly. It's not made in the same way. You don't live in a society where you have these trees that you're getting it from, and so on. They're processed, perhaps made in China. You don't know. I mean, you could kind of look into some of these types of things, but it's coming in a nice processed packet, and it's not the same, right? It's not the same. And of course, it can be used in a similar kind of capacity. And don't get me wrong. Anybody who uses it, it's just fine. I'm not discouraging anybody from using it. But the thing to point out, which is why I said at the beginning that you should forget what you know, is that what we should have learned is that the maqsid and the asl for all of this is actually oral hygiene, right? Is maintaining a good sense of oral hygiene, and anything that you use to fulfill that fulfills it from a religious perspective. And then the of any type of merit now of using an actual natural wooden toothstick is only from the perspective that there is a medicinal benefit of some of those nutrients and the like, which you can opt for, but it's not a requirement. Right? It's not. There's not like a specific religious element to some nutrients, and that's why a lot of those things. Again, look, it's Sheikh Abdul Fattah actually mentioned some of these things himself, but it's also understood from what the fuqaha are saying, even when they talk about specific toothsticks. Right. So even what's transmitted from Abu Hanifa, you can check the Sharh of the Shari'atul Islam on the idea of the siwak, and he transmits something from Abu Hanifa in Tibb al-Nabawi, and again the ta'lil which is given for why you should choose Iraq, for example, is again very generic type of thing. It's not a religious ta'lil. It's just a medical type of thing. So anyway, I hope that was eye-opening, and I hope it was beneficial. And if you have any questions or comments or feedback or the like, then I would be very happy to hear it. And inshallah, we'll use the our group for that. So barakallahu ta'ala fikum. Inshallah, we'll stop here. Keep me in your du'as. Inshallah, I'll see everybody again soon. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.